morning, Assalamu alaikum, and a very warm welcome to this history conference. Today is the second day. We had very fascinating presentations yesterday, 2 panels we had with eminent speakers who are also here. We had a very good keynote speech, and today we are entering into the second day of this conference, doing history in Pakistan, a very pertinent topic. Today we have 3 scholars with us, and they will be presenting their papers. Just few guidelines: please switch off your phone, and we'll open the floor after the presentations, and you can note down your questions and ask the questions to all the panelists in the question and answer session. I'm Sajjad Ahmad, and I'm a lecturer at Social Sciences and Liberal Arts Department at IBA. I also teach history and political science courses, though I'm not a trained historian, let me admit that. So the first speaker, the panel that we are having, this is the 3rd panel. As I told you, we had 2 panels yesterday in the main campus, and here we are today in the city campus with our 3rd panel and a roundtable session that we will have after this panel. So it's Historising, Labor, Ecology and Economy. This is the title of our panel, and the speakers that we have. The first speaker is Dr. Ahmed Azhar. He is assistant professor at the Department of Social Sciences and Liberal Arts at the IBA-Karachi. He received a PhD in history from the University of Göttingen, Germany, and an MA in history from the School of Oriental and African Studies, UK. His prior research focused on the history of labor movements in late colonial Punjab. This research culminated in the monograph Revolution in Reform, Trade Unionism in Lahore from 1919 to 70. Published by Orient Black Swan in 2019. He is presently working on a project that explores the history of initiatives by various leftist progressive forces of Pakistan to educate the working classes. Dr. Ahmed Azhar will be presenting his paper on the case of labor history in the reinterpretation of South Asia subaltern movements. Our next speaker with us is Dr. Hassan Heather Karrar. He is Associate Professor at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Lahore University of Management Sciences, LUMS. He has joined us from Lahore. He arrived in Karachi from Lahore. He received his PhD in East Asian Studies and MA in History from McGill University, Canada. His ongoing research explores emerging economic and spatial configurations in and between China, Central Asia, and Pakistan. His recent articles have appeared in Globalization, Central Asian Survey, Critical Asian Studies, and with co-authors in Capitalism, Nature, Socialism, and Critical Public Health. His earlier research on the development of Sino-Central Asian relations was published by the University of British Columbia Press in 2009 under the title The New Silk Road Diplomacy, China's Central Asian Foreign Policy Since the Cold War. Dr. Hassan Karrar will be presenting his paper on ecology as history, reading the past through the present in the Indus Delta. Our 3rd speaker is Dr. Fakhar Bilal. He has arrived from Islamabad. He is from Quaid-e-Azam University, where he is assistant professor at the Department of History. He gained his PhD in Modern South Asia History from Royal Holloway University of London and MPhil in History from Quaid-e-Azam University. His doctoral research was on colonial and post-colonial Multan and its development with reference to religious education, religious seminaries, and their impact on society. So we have these 3 speakers with us. I may request Dr. Ahmed Azhar to present his paper. Yes, and then we'll have the...
So generally I like to begin with a joke, but while I was reading this thing, I realized that perhaps it is an extended and rather crude joke in itself. But anyhow, now that I've got you all excited about the talk, I'll read it out. I'll stick to the script. I won't deviate because I won't be able to make it back to 20 minutes. So here goes nothing. Today, I'm going to argue that developments within and around the field of South Asian history over roughly the last 3 decades hold valuable lessons for us in our context if we want to explore subaltern politics. I begin with an extremely brief overview of a very small segment of the field of South Asian labor historiography before I move on to discuss my own empirical research, which is on Lahore's labor movement. And then I talk about how it draws upon and feeds into the central preoccupations of the field. Reflections on methodology are woven into the narrative, but at certain points I will also explicitly spell out by certain approaches or by relying on certain kinds of source material in is actually useful. So the late 1980s marked both a moment of crisis as well as revival in South Asian labor historiography. Beginning in the early 1980s, the hugely influential Subaltern Studies Collective puts up a spirited challenge to the established Marxist framework for grasping working class politics. The focus shifts abruptly from urban, industrial, and to a large extent unionized workers to the peasantry. Soon, however, we witness a decline of the subaltern, which became apparent in the larger scheme of the project as subsequent volumes turned away from the careful reconstruction of moments of subaltern initiative, concerning themselves instead with the ways and means in which a post-enlightenment West continues to dominate the cultures of the Northwest through westernized local elites and middle classes. The rustic peasant truly made room for the Babu and his learned dispositions, which could now potentially offer insights into the making of colonial discourses. The urban factory proletarian had similarly, though somewhat earlier, emerged as an idealized abstraction from the interplay of Marxist and modernist discourses. In concrete terms, this abstraction implied a disembedding of the worker from the web of relationships that placed him simultaneously in the realm of the urban and the rural, the formal and the informal, the shop floor and the neighborhood, the pre-bourgeois and the capitalist. South Asian labor history in the course of the 1980s began dismantling these binaries. Aspects of the neoliberal restructuring of the economy, for instance, the breaking of large-scale formal sector vertically integrated production plants into informal, dispersed, small-scale units, and the associated decline of trade unionism forced this rethinking. Such economic restructuring was, of course, a global phenomenon, but its implications and responses to it varied greatly between the North and the South. Labor history foregrounds these differences by detailing the extremely diverse ways in which labor relations have been reconstituted in specific contexts. The core debates around the dismantling of the forementioned binaries can be distilled in the polemic between Rajnarayan Chandawalkar and Dipesh Chakrabarty. Dipesh Chakrabarty wrote the immensely popular Rethinking Working Class History, which essentially argued for the irreducible presence of pre-bourgeois culture and mentalities in the distinct form of capitalism introduced by the colonial state in India. Workers in this perspective were beholden to ties of a feudal nature, not only in relation to their masters, but also to their middle class or Bhadralok and elite leaders. In a sense, then, Chakrabarty alluded to the impossibility of a mature working class to emerge from within such a culture. Rethinking, published in 1989, can be seen not so much as the harbinger of new trends, as a terminus at which various onward debates converged. The other central character in these debates, Chandawalkar, argued for understanding the peculiarities of Indian industry and its labor, not through the prism of cultural difference, but rather as rational, strategic accommodations to specific economic pressures in a given context. Astute observers of this historiography point out how both strains converge on the point of denying workers the agency to negotiate, let alone subvert their economic and cultural conditions. At the close of the 1980s, then, labor history can be said to have reached an impasse between two kinds of determinisms, cultural and economic, and neither are terribly exciting from the perspective of those interested in restoring workers as agents in their own story. The next crop of labor historians chose to bypass these sterile debates in order to patiently reconstruct instead the grassroots, everyday realities of working lives. The relationship inverted in this sense, from the concrete to the generalizable, has opened up, in my opinion at least, newer perspectives on laboring lives and their representation. It is this new style of labor historiography that informed my own research and led me to the questions that I put before you now. The emphasis in this talk will be on elements that hopefully transcend themes that are exclusively of interest to labor historians and instead address larger questions around the historiography of subaltern movements. The trade union movement of Lahore's railway workers, going back to the immediate post-World War I period, forms the terrain of our exploration. This movement was concentrated around the railway workshops of Lahore, which at their peak in the years leading up to partition, employed up to 40,000 workers. That figure begins to plummet in the closing decades of the 20th century, and today these cavernous structures present a haunted look on most days. The first union of the workshop laborers was formed in 1920 by an Indian-born and bred Irishman named J.B. Miller. Miller was from the white working classes of India. A repeat offender, he had been dismissed from various government jobs, ostensibly for insubordination. He arrives at Lahore in early 1920 and within months has successfully built up a union comprising most of the railway workshop employees. Soon thereafter, a strike is declared. The demands are primarily economic in nature, but the negotiations over pay get drowned out by what the workers argue is a matter of pride. The railway administration refuses to recognize Miller as their official representative and they refuse to back down. During the strike agitation, a distinct, tension-ridden culture of popular protest emerges in Lahore. The seeming contradictions of this emerging sphere of subaltern politics are many, but let me restrict this down to a few which challenge the movement's assumption, its appropriation by both nationalist and socialist hagiographies. Let's begin with the most superficial but also the most symbolic. The movement is led by a white man who marches his so-called army of the poor under the Union Jack, but also at other moments threatens a Bolshevik revolution or a revolt like that of his Irish brothers if the workers' demands are not met. In terms of political support, Miller is open to temporarily align with mainstream political parties as well as the Khilafatists and even the few socialist groupuscules that exist at that time. However, nothing enduring in organizational terms emerges from these dalliances, and over the next 2 decades, the movement under Miller maintains a hard-fought autonomy from larger political currents. Both the communists and the Congress are repeatedly above, and the railway authorities are warned that if they do not listen to the genuine grievances of the workers, then they will be waylaid by either the communists or the Congress. It is only through tracing the movement's rhetoric and forms of protest over a long term that its complex and contradictory ideological underpinnings can be grasped. One way to do this is by reading official sources against the grain. Intelligence Department correspondence for the late colonial period regularly reports on this labor movement, alternating violently between deep respect and utter disdain. Local newspapers, especially in the vernacular, provide further detail and also a sense of the movement's deep and lasting impress on popular imagination. Fiction, for instance, a novel by Ishbal, in which the main protagonist is a railway leader, forms yet another source which stands in contrast to the prose of counterinsurgency, as to how we call it. The voluminous Royal Commission on Labour reports in India fill in significant details regarding the labour process and also provide a platform to dissident labour leaders for voicing their grievances. Trial proceedings provide, like the Pirate conspiracy case, enable us to trace the discursive pathways leading to the ideological construction of what we have come to naively accept as the watertight, mutually exclusive compartments of revolutionary and reformist politics. An interesting bricolage of working class politics emerges from combining these disparate sources. Once such an approach is taken, it becomes obvious that this working class movement was essentially resisting its absorption, the absorption of a necessarily contingent form of working class self-assertion into the bigger story of either nationalist or socialist politics. We begin to see, in simpler terms, the movement, so to speak, on its own terms. Through this working class movement's making and unmaking, we also get a sense of the overarching processes behind the coalescing and the disintegration of a broader plebeian alliance that was emerging in the immediate aftermath of World War I. The working class movement of Mughalpura attempted at the beginning to knit a broad plebeian alliance involving both blue and white collar workers. For a brief moment, these efforts appear to have borne fruit. The fracturing of this alliance and the subsequent reification of the Mazdoor and Babu binary can be plausibly traced to distinctions within the labour process, which reinforced through everyday processes and experiences the schisms within the larger sphere of popular politics. Internal railway workshop records dating back to the 1920s, fragmented though they might be, still provide reasonably detailed snapshots of labor relations at certain moments. These largely untapped records of the colonial railway enterprise present an especially fertile source for reconnecting the arbitrarily severed histories of capital, colonialism, and labor. In this instance, they show how organizational restructuring in the interwar decades, ostensibly to rationalize and standardize labor, and also in tune with the Taylorist principles of management that were on the vogue at that time, they in fact privileged the labor of the Babus and also placed them in positions of authority with respect to the Mazdoor. The intrusion of the Babu into the previously autonomous domain of the Mistris, and the Mistris were of course skilled workers who had risen through the ranks to occupy supervisory positions. This was seen by these Mistris as yet another instance of the colonial state reproducing larger social inequalities within the space of the workshop. Similarly, the demand for Indianization or nationalization of the railways led by the Congress was recast by these workers as a case of denationalization. They argued in their depositions to the commissions of inquiry on labor that true nationalization would have meant leveling of the hierarchies that permeated society. Whereas in the present situation, the interests of privileged, upper class and upper caste groups were being advanced at the expense of the deserving poor. If the organized working classes of Lahore refused to make common cause with the Congress, one possible answer may well be sought in the realm of labor relations and politics. These are just a few examples of how the lens of labor, if applied consistently, can possibly open up new perspectives on subaltern movements in concrete historical conjunctures. Otherwise, we are left with essentializing arguments about the supposed compatibility or incompatibility of an idealized working class consciousness with socialist, nationalist, or anti-colonial politics. If workers during this period were not mobilized by nationalist or socialist slogans, it need not be dismissed as a case of what we've come to know as false consciousness. There were identifiable strains within the broader field of popular politics, as well as in the internal structure of the workplace and the workers' organizations, which can possibly provide clues to this larger disillusionment. Therefore, we consider next the internal dynamics of the sphere of working class politics through the prism of trade unionism. Traditionally, a focus on trade unionism implies both an economistic as well as a top-down approach, where we dwell on the role of elite and middle-class interlocutors in the settlement of disputes over material resources. However, I argue through my research that revisiting the terrain of trade unionism and reconstructing ties that bound elite and subaltern remains deeply relevant for a grounded critique of progressive politics. After all, the culture within the parties and trade unions determined the limits of workers' autonomy and the prospects of their emancipation from the working class condition. The oral testimonies and the rare memoirs of worker militants and working class trade unionists point to the reinforcement of social hierarchies within the sphere of progressive politics. Such ego documents are scattered among various left-leaning NGOs and the back offices of what are necessarily now defunct labor federations. Difficult to locate and almost always in regional dialects, these reminiscences have not made their way to the larger conversation around progressive politics in Pakistan. Their inclusion, I believe, reorients the parameters of these debates by turning the gaze inwards. For once, shifting the focus away from the state and its machinations, as well as the upheavals of the international socialist movements. We learn from these worker militants that the mediation of the educated, elite comrade or fellow traveler remained indispensable to engage with the state, and that this dependence inscribed a permanent inequality on this relationship. Such hierarchies could also, of course, not be simply wished away. They drew sustenance from ideological and material structures transcending the limited space of workers' politics. The elite, educated comrades remained firmly in control of the party's policy, reserving all intellectual labor for themselves and reducing the subaltern's contribution contribution to the purely manual or even menial. Trade unionism, in contrast to the realm of party politics, allowed the subaltern to assert their independence of mind and to realize their capacity for leadership. It allows us to witness, albeit in a limited sphere and for a brief moment, the efflorescence of a unique subaltern consciousness before its suppression by the very voices that would claim to represent it. It is of course also a fact that since its beginning in the early 1920s, the principal target of trade unionism, the organized sector, constituted a minuscule, relatively privileged part of the working classes, what we also call the labor aristocracy. However, the politics of the organized sector had great significance for setting the horizon of expectations for the laboring classes, more generally speaking. This holds especially true for a period marked by trade unionism's remarkable downward reach and broad sweep. The multiplicity of forms of workers' organizations and the significant overlaps in the articulation of workers' politics within and between these forms forces a deeper exploration of tendencies that I have been arguing tend to be neatly subsumed under the broadly, broad and ostensibly opposed categories of, again, reform or revolution. Within the ambit of trade unionism, we find militant struggles alongside the genuine pursuit of bureaucratic structures for the routinization of dispute resolution. We find, in other words, resistance along with collaboration. If we choose to dwell upon these seeming contradictions, we might yet be able to retrieve concrete movements of subaltern self-assertion from the grip of larger ideological repertoires that presume to speak for them. Ultimately, to draw Thompson inspiration from E.P. Thompson, again, Thompson is somebody who is subalternist as well as the people who critique the subalternists borrow from. So to draw inspiration from him, it all amounts to perhaps no more than a gesture in the way of lessening the condescension of posterity towards the subaltern. In other words, to redeem a fragment of a lost dream of a peculiar vision of subaltern emancipation, otherwise obscured by the glare of various isms that continue to hold the historiography of subaltern movements in their thrall. So I believe I've ended in time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Azhar. Our second speaker, Dr. Hassan Heather Karrar. Please.
Before I begin, I want to explain ecology and what I mean by ecology. That's central to what I'm going to be talking about today. I use ecology to describe humans in their environment. So as opposed to just talking about the environment, with ecology, what we're trying to do is look at the intersection of human history and environmental history. So that's the approach that I'm taking to ecology. And the advantage of doing that is that if you foreground ecology, then there's possibilities of talking about labor history, there's possibilities of talking about class, gender, human rights, uneven development, the sort of subaltern histories that Ahmed was talking about right now. I have to confess that when Zara called me initially to invite me to this conference, I was a little bit surprised and I hesitated. And the reason why I did that was because I don't usually think of myself as doing history, albeit for reasons which are slightly different from the ones that Dr. Zadi was describing yesterday. I don't think of myself as doing history because history has a very particular notion of what the archive is. History as a cult of the archive. And the work that I do, the sort of sources that I use, usually tend to fall outside of those conventional understandings of the archive. And the other thing that I pointed out was that my work is on China, on Central Asia. At best, I could say that I'm a student of Chinese history, I'm a student of Central Asian history. I actually know very, very little about the history of South Asia. So why then am I speaking about the Indus Delta, which is a region just outside of Karachi? Well, as I'll try and explain in this talk, there are 2 points of intersection between what I'll be talking about today and the larger issues of social sciences, research, and teaching that I'm directly involved in. And by the way, this image is taken right here in Karachi. This is Ibrahim Hadri, and there was they were fixing the propeller of a boat. And if you've never tried lifting one of these things, I can assure you that I joined in as well, and I couldn't budge it. It's very, very heavy. Okay, next up. Sort of, if you look at the map on the left, this is what you would describe as the Indus Delta region. The Indus Delta region, simply put, is the terminus of the Indus River. And it can be said to extend about 150 kilometers northward and then all the way down to Rann Kutch, the border with India. And it covers about 3 districts, which would be Thatta, Badin, and Sajawal. Parts of the Indus Delta, the northernmost fringe of the Indus Delta, would extend into Korangi as well. So Korangi, Ibrahim Heidari, those of you who are familiar with the geography of Karachi, so that's sort of also included in the Indus Delta. And what would happen traditionally is that as the Indus approached the sea, it would fan out into numerous channels, and the northernmost one would have been the channel running through Karachi. Okay, this is what I'm going to be doing, and even though I have quite a few slides, I'll run through these fairly quickly. So it's not a terribly complex presentation. I'll talk about how I became, as a student of Chinese history, Central Asian history, I'll talk a little bit about how I became interested in this topic. I'll talk about what's happening there right now in the Indus Delta. I'll speak a little bit about the history of the Delta, how it came to acquire the physical characteristics that define the place right now. I'll share some examples of other places in Pakistan where we can start taking an ecological approach to studying history. And then finally, I'll just reflect a little bit on what some of the lessons from this story might actually be. Well, sort of first of all, I wanted to share this. These are screenshots from something called, they're screenshots from the website of something called the Zulfikarabad Development Authority. And the website is, as of a couple of days ago, it was still up. It was, you can go there, you can visit it. And, as you can see over here, there's quotations from Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Apparently, he had something to say about ports as well. I didn't know that, but they found something that was relevant to port building. Zulfikarabad, as the name implies, and as I'll speak about in just 1 or 2 minutes, is named after the late Prime Minister of Pakistan, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. And then, sort of at the top, you can see wind turbines and plans for special economic zones, and so on and so forth. So it sounds pretty interesting. It sounds like there's a lot going on over here, except for the fact that this city doesn't actually exist. This is all part of planning imagination. It's all, if you may, sort of an imaginary of sorts, a technocratic imaginary. So the reason I became interested in this topic was when I heard not just about Zulfikarabad, but the fact that Zulfikarabad, which is a planned port city, was going to be modeled on Shenzhen. Now, 2 things that I want to say over here. One is that plans for a port city in the Indus Delta date back until about 1996. So since 1996, different governments in power have promised a port city in the Indus Delta. And in case you're wondering why, we'll get to that in just a second. So there's plans for port cities which have been iterated multiple times in the Indus Delta. And in 2011, then President Asif Zardari revived plans for a port city by the name of Zulfikarabad, and he talked about Shenzhen. Now the thing about Shenzhen is that Shenzhen is a city in southern China. It's right across from Hong Kong. And Shenzhen was a planned city. And Shenzhen was one of the first special economic zones in China, and it developed very, very rapidly. So if you speak to people in China, they'll remind you that Shenzhen in the 1970s was a fishing village. And then they'll say, look at it now. And if you go there now, what you'll find is skyscrapers as far as the eye can see. So the Shenzhen model is a very attractive model as far as planning and development is concerned. So Zulfikarabad was supposed to be planned on Shenzhen. There was going to be enclave spaces, special economic zones. On paper, at least, these special economic zones still exist, if you believe what's on the Zulfikarabad Development Authority website. And it tapped into the geographical serendipity that has been bestowed upon Pakistan, namely the fact that Pakistan is located between East Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, Iran, Afghanistan, the Gulf states. The fact that there is something special about Pakistan's location, this is an idea that goes back at least to the 1960s, and I believe to the 1950s as well. Now, these are all grandiose plans, these are all fantastical plans, and what's interesting about them is how deeply unpopular they are in the Indus Delta, how deeply uninterested are the people who live in a place like Ibrahim Heather are. And this image on the right, this is a picture I took as we were driving towards Keti Bandar, which is a small town in the Indus Delta. And this is people demonstrating for a metalled road. And the juxtaposition I thought was really quite powerful, that here you have plans for building a fantastical port city out in the middle of a desert, and what the people actually need are what you would describe as the basic public goods, in this case, a metalled road. So that's the future, if you may. That's what's being signaled as, that's what's being promised as this sort of connected port city, a world port city, if you may. And the reality, of course, is something that is completely different. And you can start getting a sense of that if you look at the image down below. You sort of might not be able to make out, but if you can barely make out white on the ground, these are salt flats. So as you approach Keti Bandar, the vegetation completely disappears. It's a barren land, and the ground is covered in salt. So needless to say, nothing can grow over there. The stagnant pools of water that you can see in the front, these are the pools of water that livestock and humans drink from. And if there's anything left over, then they'll use that for small irrigation that is being carried out over there. There is encroachment by the sea. So every year, the sea cuts more and more land away. And you can actually see this on something like on Google Maps as well. If you have a time function, Google Earth, you can slide it back, and what you actually see is that between the 1980s and the present, the coastline is receding. So the sea is cutting away at the coastline. This was a region where traditionally there was agriculture, there was food and fruit production. That has disappeared as well. One of the shocking things about the Indus Delta is the fact that there is no water in the Indus River. So by the time the Indus reaches the sea, it's actually dry. There is, the mighty Indus is no more. And then of course there's out-migration from the Delta to places like Thatta, places like Korangi, Ibrahim, Heather. And the population of the Delta now is outside of, if you don't include Korangi, then the population of the Delta would be about 300,000 people only. And at the beginning of the 21st century, it would have been about 3 times that much. The point being that there's not anything left for people to do over there. The only source of livelihood, or the two sources of livelihood, one is participating in what you can describe as a credit-driven fishing industry, and the image on the right is fisher folk coming in with their catch and then selling this to intermediaries. And then there's some scavenging that takes place once you move a little bit away from the coast. So once you move a little bit inland, what you end up seeing is that there's people who are scavenging the commons, collecting firewood. They might have sort of small number of goats which they're herding over there. But that's pretty much it as far as the source of livelihood is concerned. I'll just go to this slide first. Now, the interesting thing is, and that it wasn't always this way. So if you speak to people who call the Indus Delta home, what you will end up finding is that they describe a very different Indus Delta in the past. And this, I think, ties in nicely with the type of conversations that we were having yesterday about using oral accounts, using memory as a historical tool. And what they will describe is floodwater irrigation. So what used to happen in the past when there was water in the Indus is that during the summer months, the Indus would overflow the banks, and that water would travel up to 8 kilometers inland, and that would irrigate the land, and that was what was making the land fertile. We also find that there was an abundance of food and fruit production. There was local forests, and the wood from the forests was being used in locomotives as well. And these are all accounts. These are all descriptions of the delta, which people today will be able to provide to you. And indeed, my own understanding of the past was initially constructed through conversations with Delta residents. And this is just an example of a colonial account from the transactions of the Bombay Geographical Society in 1840. And colonial accounts indeed corroborate this. So colonial accounts from the 19th century do indeed portray the Delta as a region which was fertile, where food was being produced, where there was an abundance of local produce. And it was also a connected region, so it was connected to other Indian Ocean port cities in the Persian Gulf and along the coast of India. And what has then been happening, the reason why we're seeing the sort of desertification today is because of upriver hydrology, which began in the late 19th century with canal colonization in the Punjab. Then there was irrigation and canal works in the 1940s, the 1960s, and as a result of that, water in the Indus Delta has been decreasing over the last 1 century, to the extent that we're now looking at a region where there is very little water and where the landscape has been completely changed. And one thing that struck me going there was the fact that it's not simply a case of saying that, well, this is a sort of a difference between Punjab and Sindh. In fact, the last place that the water is siphoned off is just upriver in Thatta. So, you know, downstream, regardless where you are in the downstream, is still downstream. So to say that Punjab is taking the water of Sindh is partly correct, but there's more layers to that than just that. Okay. So this was one example. The question then arises, you know, can we think of other examples where ecology becomes a useful tool to thinking about history, thinking about habitat, thinking about changing community? And another example that came to mind, and another one of my field sites is North Hunza. And this is an image that I took in 2012, and this is an image of boats traversing the Atabad Reservoir, otherwise known as the Atabad Lake, following a massive landslide which submerged 20 kilometers of the Karakoram Highway. And this had a huge impact on livelihoods, well-being, community for the 20,000 people who were trapped on the other side of the reservoir. This is an interesting story in of itself. It's got multiple layers. I won't try and cover it here, but this is another example that comes to mind. Yet another one that I was thinking of was plans for development along the banks of the Ravi River outside of Lahore, sort of abbreviated as Ruda. Sort of went out there with a few of my students a few weeks ago. We were speaking with people over there about how the plans to convert agricultural land into a developed city is going to transform livelihood, community, so on and so forth. And a lot of, the landscape is very different, but a lot of what the people in Lahore were saying, or outside of Lahore were saying, in areas that are part of this large planning schema, is not dissimilar from what people in the Indus Delta might say. So, the sort of question then arises, and this is my last slide, that, you know, okay, so if we take ecology as history as a framework for historical inquiry, for social sciences inquiry, you know, what are some preliminary lessons that we might be able to draw from this? One is that it gives us, it's about the history of the state, but not the history of the state in abstraction. Very often, and I think social scientists such as myself are more guilty of this than historians, but very often we talk about the state as if it's obvious to everyone what the state is. But if you foreground ecology, then there's an opportunity over here to understand and see how the state interjects into people's lives in very real, tangible ways, which have a transformative effect on community and materiality. They also tell a longer story. So if you think about the Ahmad disaster, for example, the first time that the slopes were said to be unstable were actually in the late 1990s, and this is in the newspaper. So people knew that there was going to be a landslide over there. It wasn't a secret. So there are long stories of governance, of state building, especially in peripheries. So it's a gradual history, if you may. It's a history of place unmaking. So places change, and the definition of place that I like to begin thinking about is places where lives are lived. So if you want to think about place, and especially if you want to differentiate it from space, which is much larger, much more expansive, then place foregrounds everyday life, place foregrounds people. So as a consequence of these ecological changes, we find that there's a transformation in livelihood, in community, in how people think about collective well-being. And then, of course, it leads to new spatializations as well. And along with that, it's a history of, more often than not, it's a history of dispossession, and it's undergirded by violence. Okay, and some of those are captured in the images on the right. I won't speak about that because I think I'm just about at my time limit. But the image on the left is the remaking of Ahmad. So some of you might know, it's been completely transformed from a disaster site into a tourist site. And the image on the top is Babajan's election poster. And what's interesting and relevant about him is that he was thrown in jail along with 4 other activists because they were demanding compensation for the people who were affected by the Ahmad disaster. So I'll stop over here, and if there's any questions or comments, we can pick up later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hassan. Thank you. We are now moving to our last presentation of this panel, then we'll have question and answers. Dr. Fakhar Bilal is presenting his paper on building Islam, a micro-history of Islamic education and its economic base in Multan. Dr.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you to Zahra and the entire team and Professor Akbar for inviting us. Before I move into the presentation, I'll just give a little background as well, that how we landed into a madrasa, or myself, that how I landed into that place, or the word which is usually considered to be that, oh, what are you doing there? So I might be a little bilingual as well, so that might help people to get into the actual story. So this was back when I started my PhD, and this was something which I went with a very different project that was on the princely Indian states to London. So somehow with few initial meetings with the advisor, co-advisor, and something that how to land into a different land where you live, or what Simon Wolfgang Fuchs has written, in the land of pure, that how you understand the different issues and problematizing those issues when it comes towards the society, that how people, they live their day-to-day life, how they understand that. So that was something which I started looking around myself, that the people, those who surround me, who they are, what their backgrounds are, and how they have had an interaction with us. So that came to my mind, that why not something which we practice or look around us, or which we have had a day-to-day interaction with those things. So that was the place from where I more or less thought about it, and this started all. The second incident was that when I came for first time to look into the material that was for the field work, and this is, as Professor Hasan already mentioned, that the traditional archives or the materials or accessing the archives. So it was very difficult to get into any place that those who don't know you, and the vice versa, that the one who is coming, that either you are the one जिसको World Bank ने भेजा है, either you are the one came with the funding to distort their image. So this took me at least initial 3 weeks to convince them that, look, I am a Pakistani citizen, I work in a place which is a university, so whatever I will be doing, that will be a research-based thing. So that first field was more or less very not into the same case as successful or fruitful. So eventually the second phase came and I was able to convince them because of some of the gatekeepers, those who let me introduce to those people, and eventually things started moving smoothly. So now coming towards the actual presentation. So presentation will be divided into 3 parts. One will be about the locale. This is Multan actually, or the South Punjab. Second will be about the concept of building Islam, that how we build Islam. So this might not be the same case what Professor Masouda Banu works, which is more a developmental understanding of the Islam, or what we call the social understandings of Islam. And the third side will be about the economic base, that how the Islamic education that has attracted, or the locale has attracted people to come to those places. So I'll start with the first one, that is more with the question of the locale, that how the colonial developments, they have had left the different marks on us. So some of us might have had these understandings that these were the illusions or the realities. So making that as a case, and with that case in Multan as an economic base, as Professor Hasan already mentioned, with these canal colonizations and the development, what Professor Imran Ali has also written, and people, those who have worked on the economic history from different backgrounds. So this was something that how communications, how roads, railways, networks, and economy, that has connected people. So Multan was one of the choices by 1947 when the people started migrating into this new land. So same was the case with this case study of the Jamia Khairul Madaris, on which I did my own PhD. So this was the, I call it a portable madrasa, which started in 1931 in Jalandhar, and then in 1947 arrived in Lahore with few of the boxes of their own record. And they still maintain those records. This is very interesting thing, that these are the record registers of 40, 43, 46, 47, which they brought with themselves, and they still have that lineage which they established with their past. So the reason for this locale was that या आप रोशनियों का शहर चुनेंगे या आप वो जगह देखें जहाँ पे आपके पास मौके होंगे. So this was something that the people, those who were the followers of Thanvi, Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi, and that was the initial advice given to the gentleman who was Maulana Khair Muhammad, that Multan is the place where you can look for more and more avenues and options. And the immediate question comes, the city of saints, how a Deobandi tradition can land into a place which already has a connection with a strong shrine culture, which has embedded understanding of those places. So the locale became very interesting. So Multan itself has this interest that how the city which sits at the outskirts of a princely state like Bahawalpur, how a place that sits very much close to the banks of the water, how a place which is very much connected or stimulated with the understanding of the communication channels and everything, and this is on the record that during the colonial period, it was Amritsar, Lahore and Multan, that all 3 places were the ones, those who were the bread and butter for everyone. So making that as a case, that how this locale that has helped us to understand this debate, and this has that how Multan has attracted lots of things. And same was the case with this portable madrasa or Khairul Madaris, which was established in 31 and eventually migrated to Multan. Here's a very small anecdote कि आप जब किसी जगह हिजरत करके आते हैं तो land allocation, where you will sit, where you will be based. and that was with the land inspectors in 47, those who were authorized to allocate lands to people. So this was the first time when these interactions between the shrine cultures and the Deobandi reformist tradition that came to the forefront, that the Makhdums, Gilanis, Qurayshis and Gardezis, those who are having a strong hold of the place, they were very much into action to help this madrasa to get a popular place, which is right now at the Aurangzeb Road, they call, and later on to the Sher Shah Road. And this is now very much a big madrasa with the female and the male both sides. So then comes the second side, which will be about the building Islam. So negotiating with Islam has a very much debate which started since 80s or late 80s, that how you can engage Islam, how you can put different struggles into a single context. In that case, this has, I'll just start a little bit with the latest or the concurrent histories and then going back to 80s, that it is something which 9/11 has changed the paradox. So going little back, and that was that how Islam as a religion, that has basically changed the understanding of a society. And this is what we understand by Usha Sanyal's work, this devotional Islam. Same goes vice versa, which recently Professor Qasim Zaman has written about Islam in Pakistan. Same goes from a very different perspective what David Emanuel Singh has done with the Islamization of South Asia when it comes with the Rajaji National Park, a very smaller place, that how you connect people to the religion. So there comes this understanding that the governance of Islam became a very much different pattern. So this governance of Islam is basically what I understand building Islam. So either you can call it the flow of funding, economy, capital, cash, vice versa. It is also attached with the people, those who have encountered the society from different ways. And at the third stage, this development is basically the flow of the human beings, human capital, or the investment into the futures. So there comes this governance of Islam with three established patterns, which we look into that case, and this is a very interesting book, which itself calls Governance of Islam in Colonial and Postcolonial Societies. So in that case, we find that either when it comes with the past, you divide things into three broader phases or the episodes or the spectrums. One is that how history of colonialism dealt with Mohammedans, how history of colonialism that came to the study of religions. At the second stage, then there are certain forms of governance in the post-colonial societies. What we did since 47 is a very much good example, that the continuous experiments going in that base, and be it Islamic education, be it the idea from the state apparatus, be it the idea of the post-coloniality, or be it the idea of the society, that how they have adopted those things. And then last stage comes, which is a very much, I would say, a fashion these days when someone wants to work on religion, not only Islam, but religion, and that is the development side. You always attach it with the policy, and then you start getting something into that, and that is more what we call the Western opportunities to look into the development side. So this is the second thing which I call the building Islam, and I built this entire project around that Jamia Khair al-Madaris. So there comes this interface between economy, religion, human capital, Islamic education, learning, and that has that Ayub Khan's this green revolution that has left an impact. Multan being an agrarian society, having that background, that how people they started getting into those businesses. And this was the reason that how this entire governance pattern that has came to the forefront. And there you can find that what I have already written in my abstract, that the variety of literature, that archives, personal collections, and the people, those who are maintaining the records. One interesting thing is that if those who know about this Islamic education system or the madrasa system itself, that this was one of the madrasas. I have been to many madrasas while doing my own field work and few other projects, that this was the one, those who were maintaining that project from the archival mindset, and they have maintained a wonderful archive. So institutional archive, that has one reason, that how the literature that has flown into the case. So now we'll be coming towards all three to make a one connection: Multan, a portable madrasa, and building Islam. So this was the debate on the different junctures, that how this understanding of this madrasa that grown over the period of time, that from 47 till almost 2001, they became very focal, central mouthpiece of the Deobandis of Pakistan. So that was the reason that from almost 70s and 80s onwards, they were the ones, those who were involved in the Wafaq or the different education boards. They were the ones, those who were attached with a very much reformist Deobandi tradition. They were the ones, those who have had certain community initiatives. And that was the reason that where we find those respective understandings, that it is the micro-history of Islamic education which attracted a large base of the popular citizenship, and that built Islam. And this building Islam was, on one hand, building the institution. On the other hand, it was building the society. And on the third tier, that was developing an urban area. So interesting was that the graduates of the same institution, they have created a network of the institutions across the country. So they have right now, this was by the time when I was there for my last field in 2018, that their own graduates have created more than 7 branches within the city and 27 across the country. So looking into that case, or the understanding that how the micromanagement of Islamic education, that became a very much relevant perspective when it comes towards building Islam, or the model for building Islam. And the last one is the economic base. So this was not only the Multan which was important throughout this project, or looking into that case, this was also the people, those who supported these initiatives. So that was the case, that how this entire institution, which was initially only a one-room place and now a very huge complex, recently like in 2018, 4 crore रुपए से वो मस्जिद तामीर कर रहे हैं. So this is just one example, that how this huge complex, which again goes with the same theoretical framework, what I understand, that building Islam comes through those understandings, what we look into, mukhayyar hazrat chanda dete hain. So you never know that how that money flows in. You never know where that audit comes out of. You never know that how this entire edifice or the structure, which they call Darul Aqama, then later on Takhassus or different other degrees or the programs which they offer. And they have, for example, more than 1,500 students, those who are boarder on the campus, those who live, those who eat there, those who get their education. So looking into all those understandings when it comes towards this question, that how this Islamic education, which again has relatively very clear understanding, which we find that how society has learnt about religion, how society has associated themselves with the religion, and how the society that look forward, and this is very much a good thing as well, which comes from the social perspective, that how they look into the world hereafter. So that makes this sense that how the city of Multan in the South Punjab, that became one of the place, and this is something that within Multan we find these two very interesting institutions. One is Jamia Khairul Madaris and other is Jamia Qasimul Ulum. Both of them, they have had a very different tradition from the both Deobandi schools of thought, but still one with the power corridor, one with the religious point of view, one becoming the mouthpiece of the Wifaqs or their education boards, one becoming the ally in the state, in particularly creating this Pakistan Madrasa Education Board and all the policies since 9/11. So since 47, what my understanding with this project was that the Building Islam project that constantly is going on, and this constant process or the continuity that has certain experiments which the successive regimes or the political governments, they have done so far. And I'll just give you a couple of examples, and that is from the Madrasa Education Report of 79, that how many of these Deobandi madrasas, they refused state funding through zakat. And that again, one was the reason that we do not want to attach themselves or ourselves with the state funding and later on accepting state narrative. Same is the case when it comes with the Islamic Ideology Council. Same comes with the Islamic Research Institute. Same comes with those certain experiments which we did since 47, and still we have had that, I would say, either the reality or the elusive dream that either we are building Islam, and this I leave with a question for everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fakhar. Now we'll open the floor for the question answer. आप लोग उर्दू में भी सवाल कर सकते हैं, इंग्लिश में भी कर सकते हैं, मिक्स्ड लैंग्वेज भी हो सकती है. तो अपना तारुफ करा दें कि आप कौन लोग हैं, आपका नाम क्या है और जिससे आपको सवाल करना है. सवाल मुख्तसर रखिएगा. हम करेंगे ये कि 3 क्वेश्चंस ले लेंगे पहले और फिर हम अपने पैनलिस्ट से कहेंगे कि वो उनका आंसर करें. उसके बाद फिर हम मज़ीद 3 सवाल और इस तरह से करके हम लेंगे. Before we move on to Dr. Zari, let me just first just one question with Dr. Hasan. Thank you very much for this presentation. And the interesting bit is that you are traveling from the south and going up towards the north and discussing the ecological and other issues that are having. My question is that when you are talking about the Indus Delta, particularly this community where there is land erosion due to sea and there's hardly any agriculture and people relying on the seafood, do you also see a depletion, and how long will they rely on that? Do you also see, because of the pollution and other factors which are impacting on the sea life, is there any sort of fear among the community that whether these resources which they are extracting from the sea are also depleting? Do they have any observation for that?
So thank you. That's an excellent question, and I think people are acutely aware of the fact that the livelihoods that they used to enjoy, even forget a century ago or half a century ago, but even in the 1980s, those livelihoods are no longer possible now. And in fact, there's been a huge out-migration since the early 2000s. Along with that, places of residence have disappeared as well. The late Muhammad Ali Shah of the Pakistan Fisher Folk Forum used to say that the Keti Bandar right now is the third Keti Bandar. There used to be a Keti Bandar that got eaten away by the sea. Then there was a second Keti Bandar that got eaten away by the sea as well. And then now Keti Bandar is in its third iteration. And that, as I understand it, that out-migration continues. But it's really being forced to choose between 2 bad choices: staying and and subsisting in a credit-driven fishing industry, or moving to a place like Korangi, Ibrahim Hedri, potentially Thatta. One of the things that they're very clear about is that they don't want Zulfiqarabad to be built, because their response is that if you build Zulfiqarabad, then जो 3 लाख लोग वहाँ मौजूद हैं उन्हें आप कहाँ फेंकेंगे? So they see that as a land grab. They see that as an attempt to displace people. Yeah, I mean and by the way, I mean the other thing that I find interesting, which I don't know very much about, these are really conversations which are ongoing, is that the dispossession of people is not just taking place in the Delta, but also along the Hawke's Bay area. And that's been happening for about 13-14 years as well. And what the fisher folk over there say is that they no longer have access to the mangroves, which is where they would engage in subsistence fishing during the monsoon, during the summer seasons, where they would move their boats inwards. So that's been cut off as well.
Thank you very much. And you aptly said that, in 1990s, when you talk about Atabad disaster, that people knew that, this land erosion is happening. So the interesting bit is that, in the south you have less water, and in the north you have
Sure.
An abundance of water, and glacial lake outburst floods which are also displacing people and destroying the crops. Okay, so we are opening the floor. We'll take 3 questions first. Dr. Akbar, Dr. Tahir Kamran, and then Dr. Saqib.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Hasan. It's a footnote to what you said. I'm more interested in the footnote. आपने कहा था कि this idea of Pakistan's geography and its location was, I mean, today we talk about, you know, the geostrategic benefit, complete bullshit, but we talk about it anyway. But I'd like to know a little bit about its history. आपने कहा it started from the 60s. Then you said no, actually it started from the 50s. So, you know, how has that manifest? I mean, that's not part of your paper, but I found that very interesting. एक तो ये फखर बिलाल के लिए सवाल है कि ये तस्वुर किया जाता है, शायद सही है गलत है, आप ये भी बता दें कि सराइकी इलाका जो है और झंग जिस पे ताहिर कामरान ने कल थोड़ा बहुत हमें बताया था, ये जो है सेक्टेरियनिज्म की जड़ तो नहीं मैं कहूँगा, यहाँ पे सबसे ज़्यादा मिलिटेंसी भी होती है और सेक्टेरियनिज्म भी होती है, दोनों चीज़ें, शिया सुन्नी भी और इंट्रा सुन्नी भी, जिसको आप मिलिटेंसी कहते हैं, जो कहते हैं। अब आप मुझे ये बताएं कि आपके जो आपने हवाला दिया है काम से, और अक्सर ये भी जो स्कॉलर्स लिख चुके हैं इसमें शिया सुन्नी फसाद पे, झंग में ख़ास तौर पे वो कहते हैं कि ज़मीन का मसला है, इट्स अबाउट द सेटलमेंट दैट टुक प्लेस आफ्टर 1947 और वगैरह वगैरह। तो मुझे ये बताइएगा कि इसके बारे में ज़रा बताइएगा कि जो सेक्टेरियनिज्म है इस इलाके में और मिलिटेंसी है, क्या उसकी कैन वन फाइंड सम क्लूज फ्रॉम योर वर्क?
Hassan, I want you to say a bit more on contextualizing this, the dilemma and the difficult situation that Indus Delta finds itself in right now, because one of the slides that you showed, and that canal colonization in Punjab was mentioned, but you didn't touch upon that. So can we infer out of that slide and that mention of canal colonization that that was the first step towards this this depredation that Indus Delta finds itself in right now? And second question is for Fakhar. Can you please tell us in juxtaposition, in comparison, because there are 3 major madrasas, Khairul Madaris that you mentioned, then Banori town in Karachi, then Akura Khatak. So in terms of sectarianism or this religiously exclusionary mechanism that we find very much prevalent in Pakistan, how would you rank the Khairul Madaris as a propeller of sectarian identity, in Pakistan? Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. This is Saqib Sharif. I teach finance at IBA-Karachi. So my question is from Dr. Ahmed Azhar. So you talked about labor, being a labor historian, you talk about different movements, labor, trade union. My question is slightly not very relevant to what you presented, but as a historian I want to pick up your mind. Recently government of Sindh has revived or restored the student unions, right? तो यूजुअली आप अगर एक्सपर्ट से बात करें वो कहते हैं ये बहुत अच्छा इकदाम है, राइट? लेकिन व्हेन वी लुक एट द पब्लिक सेक्टर यूनिवर्सिटीज़ ऑफ सिंध स्पेशली, तो उसका बहुत ही बुरा हाल है. लाइक क्वालिटी ऑफ एजुकेशन देख लें या एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन के इश्यूज देख लें. इवन अनफॉर्चुनेटली सीनियर प्रोफेसर्स एंड वाइस चांसलर्स हैव बीन अक्यूज्ड एंड फाउंड इन डिफरेंट टाइप्स ऑफ हैरेसमेंट्स, राइट? तो बहुत ही बुरा हाल है. नॉट टू काउंट द बलूचिस्तान पब्लिक सेक्टर यूनिवर्सिटीज, उसका तो पता नहीं क्या हाल होगा. तो इस तरह के फ्रेजाइल एनवायरनमेंट में do you think a revival of student unions will bring any balance, or it will be a more disaster? So how you see it? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We can go in the order. Dr. Hasan.
Thank you. Dr. Zadi, I've in an earlier project I looked at the resumption of trade between China and Pakistan, and that happens in 1969. And at that time, the Karakoram Highway they're building the Karakoram Highway, but it's not complete. It becomes crossable in 1972. And what happened in 1969, 1970, 71 was that pack animals would cross at Mintika, which was the traditional crossing point between Gilgit and Kashgar. And it was a much celebrated event. There was talk of resuming overland trade between the PRC and Pakistan since 1964. And by 1966, 67, it's being written about, including in the international press. And one of the things that's striking about that is that they're talking about how this is going to be a major new route within Asia, and they're talking about connectivity in a much, much larger scale, as opposed to connectivity between Gilgit and Kashgar, or northern Pakistan and Sinkiang. Then in the 1990s, the idea of connectivity, I think, enjoys a bit of a renaissance with the end of the Cold War, and we see that idea being iterated sort of in the early 2000s, particularly enthusiastically by Musharraf. So it's also interesting that in 2006, which is when the Musharraf regime is talking about port development in the Indus Delta, they're also opening the port in North Pakistan at Sust. And port development here in the Indus Delta nothing was ever done about it, but they did open a port in North Pakistan in partnership with the Chinese SOE, Sinotrans Sinkiang. And Musharraf was present at the opening of that port. And he gave a speech, and that speech is available because it was reported by the national media. And in that we see very clearly how enthusiastic he is about connectivity. And when he talks about connectivity, he's including India as well. And that idea, it keeps coming up. We see this, I think, most poignantly with regards to CPEC. And just now when the government officials returned from Russia, they came back once again, we're talking about connectivity. So this whole notion that there is some geographical serendipity on our side is certainly going back in an almost unbroken lineage to the 1960s. For the 1950s, I've read in secondary sources that even back then there was discussion that there's something special about Pakistan's location which gives it an advantage. But that's stuff that I still need to excavate. But certainly till the 1960s, one sees different iterations of the idea. Dr. Kamran, absolutely. Canal colonization is I think the first step in a longer process of upriver hydrology that decreases water in the Indus Delta. I don't think it's the decisive step, but certainly that's when the reduction in water flows in the Indus begins. Then the 1940s, upriver irrigation in parts of Sindh, more upriver hydrology in the 1960s. So essentially what we're seeing is water levels decreasing slowly. And the people that I speak with, they don't single out one event. For them, it's a disaster, a century in the making. So it's compounded, which I think Sajjad sort of really, in a way, complements what you're saying as well, or what you mentioned about the Atabad disaster too. That for at least a decade and a half, one knew that the slopes were unstable, which goes to an idea that critical geographers will emphasize, that there is no such thing as a natural disaster. All of these at some level are representative of fissures, failures in political economy, resource distribution, infrastructure, and we actually see them when we get out to these vulnerable peripheral places.
Thank you for both the questions. The first one, I'll just look into that. This is not about the territory or the South Punjab itself. For example, the case study on which I worked myself, that student population hails from the entire Pakistan. So when it comes with the background of the student registration, So that becomes very much first question, that how you look into the sectarian orientations. I won't say divides. The orientations come, for example, जब वो सालाना दौरा करवाते हैं, what they call the सालाना तक़सीम तक़रीब असनाद. So in that case, they usually invite people from all the sectarian backgrounds. So that gives this particular institution that, at least I would say, the added advantage, or in other words, the upper hand, to consolidate those things while showing at least to the world or the outer population that, look, we are not the ones those who go for these things. But when it comes towards the other side, wherever they are sitting for the negotiations on tables or everything, there of course they have very clear lines which they never cross. For example, I have looked into their Shura Karwai, or the understanding which they made or developed over the period of time. Like the people, those who were on their Shura in 70s, 80s, they were very clear-headed. Slowly and gradually, the people, they started coming from different backgrounds on Shura. For example, Multan Rewadi wale hain, bahut popular hain. They are now on their Shura. So as one of the donor, they are on the case. So in that case, their personal identity doesn't matter to the madrasa or to themselves, but the reason is that उन्होंने मुख्तलिफ औकात में वादा किया to build the building and something, and of course the complex which is right now being seen by everyone, few of the rooms and the shops, they are constructed by the same particular business hub. So in that case, I won't say that how that happens in Jhang. Multan is a very different case study. And the only reason is that the population of Multan, that has a very mix of the people, those who are the migrants and the settlers. So that is the answer to the first question. The second question, which Professor Tahir Kamran said, that how the religious exclusivity or the idea for propelling these things and Khairul Madaris position. So first of all, that also comes with their own understanding with the identity. For example, till the time in 71, 72 or up to 74, when Maulana Khair Muhammad himself was looking into the matters of the entire institution, that was a different case, because their position was very clear to the people, those who followed them, or at least the path which they followed from the original Jamia Deoband. But since this current gentleman came to the entire institutional hierarchy, Maulana Khalif Janildari himself, so then since that time this is very different. And if I would have to say something, that it's always the Akoda Khatak which takes the lead, not Khairul Madaris, not Banoria, not even Jamia Sharfiya, because all of them, they come from the same stream of the individual understanding of that same identity. And there comes this question that how their understanding for looking into those places that keeps changing. For example, their latest Shura that started taking people from the academics. Before that, it was all madrasa graduates or the ulemas or the learned scholars from different backgrounds, different provincial backgrounds. And all that again was with the only single understanding of their Deobandi faith. But now they are opening up to the people, while this, my understanding is, and if I might be wrong, that they are now coming out with a softer image to the world to tell them, like, look, we are not the ones which you portray us. And that is what I have seen while going time and again into field for the longer periods, for the shorter periods, while staying on their place, observing many things. No doubt they themselves, for example, one of their gentlemen who is, I am not sure he's still there as their Hasan or the trader, he used to tell that, ji, is ground mein hum 80 mein bahut mashkein karwaya karte the. I can easily relate that, what they have produced their literature through that monthly magazine, Al-Khair. But slowly and gradually they change their positions. And that disposition can one see in their own manifestation of the different functions which they perform into the madrasa. Because since 90s, they have started an English school, Al-Khair. Since 98, they have started looking to develop relationship with the outer world in case of the foreign missions or the donor agencies. Since 2009 onwards, they have had attracted, and this is what I would say, they have attracted the foreign visitors or the dignitaries to visit them. And that includes, which I have seen in their Kitabul Ara or the suggestion book, that the British Foreign Minister was once their visitor. US Education Foundation is a frequent visitor. US Ambassador is a frequent visitor. So that can put that connection with them, that how this entire conundrum or the understanding of that identity they are shaping up or they are coming out to. So I hope that is something, if my own understanding is, if one has to put the order, that will be a Koda Khatak number 1, Benoria number 2, and Khairul Madaris will be the last one in that place.
Okay, Saqib Saab, thank you for engaging with the talk. So my work is on labor unions, not so much on student unions, but they're of course interrelated. And the interface between the two is of course something I focus on very much. The relationship between what we say, the intellectual and the worker. So that relationship I try to argue in my work has shifted over the very long duration that I look at, roughly 100 years, but certain things keep, reoccurring. So certain inequalities keep showing up over and over. So the nature of the relationship ultimately is such that given the broader social inequalities that we have here, the claim to level those hierarchies and to level the terrain doesn't really always work out in the party. And in fact, what happens sometimes, or usually, is that those hierarchies that distinguish between manual and intellectual labor get reified. They harden within the space of the party. So again, unionization, whether it's student unions or labor unions, my work, the only thing I got really out of it was the understanding that to understand the meaning of unionization, you have to treat it in its historical context. So what we generally find are these larger discourses which place unionization either in the category of reformism or revolution. So that's something where the label is determining the content and not the other way around. So when you actually look at trade unionism in the interwar period, when you look at it in the post-partition period, what you find is of course a very seemingly contradictory situation. So there are impulses which you would call reformist. So there is an emphasis on organization. The idea that if you just organize, the goal will be achieved. You don't have to worry about the goal of socialist revolution, just organize, and through that process gradually, you'll get there. So there's that perspective. Then there's also very militant struggles, where you very clearly argue for the dismantling of capitalism and the state. So both voices, both tendencies coexist in certain moments. So again, सारा point ही मेरा ये है कि अगर आपने यूनियनिज्म को समझना है तो आप ये नहीं कह सकते कि ये अच्छी चीज़ है, बुरी चीज़ है. आपने देखना है कि जो कॉन्टेक्स्ट है और जो यूनियनाइजेशन की जो शेप है, फॉर्म है, वो क्या है, और उसकी जो अंडरस्टैंडिंग है उसको आपको बहुत डिलिबरेटली अनरेवल करना पड़ता है कि वो कह क्या रहे हैं. सो हम उनको सुनते नहीं हैं जनरली. हम अस्यूम करते हैं कि अगर ये ट्रेड यूनियनिज्म की बात कर रहे हैं तो ये रिफॉर्म की बात कर रहे हैं या कि ये कोई एंटी रेवोल्यूशनरी बात कर रहे हैं. लेकिन जब आप कॉन्क्रीट कॉन्टेक्स्ट में देखते हैं तो आपको पता चलता है कि नहीं, इवन ट्राइंग टू ऑर्गेनाइज इन सर्टन सिचुएशंस इज अ रेवोल्यूशनरी एक्ट. इन अ लार्जर सेटअप where you're not allowed to do so, it can be something that is very radical and revolutionary. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Ji, Seher, you were asking a question.
Seher Shah. Dr. Fakhar, my question is to you. So it's about curriculum. That's what I'm interested in. And you touched on this a little bit when you talked about the English school. Clearly, the Khairul Madaris has been a very successful program. So given the numbers of expansion of students and numbers of campuses, etc. But what is it about the curriculum that has helped it expand, and how has the curriculum changed? In some ways, perhaps it might have stayed true to its original agenda, and in some ways it might have changed. If you could expand on that a little.
I have one question, thank you. I have two. So one is for Ahmed Azhar. Thank you very much for that presentation. I wanted to ask, in your presentation we got, some idea of how labor history can happen and should happen and what the archives might be. And you pointed us to particular directions, in which this kind of research can be done. I wanted to ask, when we were trying to put together a course for students the last semester, trying to look for examples of labor history in Pakistan that has been done. If you compare to things which have been done in England, the 19th century, 20th century, as early as the early 19th century, they were looking at factory records and why some laborer is leaving and for what job, and such detailed work. And of course, in history in general in Pakistan, not just labor history, but history in general should have been better. But given that, there was excitement in the 60s and 70s, why didn't it translate into some kind of, something better? And do you think that we are looking at a direction now where we might see something now? Because, what we do find, I try to ask people, historians, I asked Dr. Zaidi, we find maybe memoirs of people in the labor movement, but not actual work done in a rigorous way, looking at records and data, and not that kind of labor history, which would have been very, very interesting to look at. So that's one question for you, thank you. And one for Fakhar. Dr. Bilal, my question for you is that in this madaris, sorry, I just forgot the question. I'm sorry. I'll ask you later. It slipped my mind. Okay.
Yes. Any more question for this round? Or the panelists can answer. Okay, so you can answer the questions, and then we'll move for the next three.
Thank you, sir, for the curriculum side. I intentionally have not spoken about it. The reason was that this is more about the exact theme what I want to speak about. So regarding curriculum, there are different methods and the techniques which the madrasa adopted since 47. They came with original Dars-e-Nizami in 47, Mullah Sadra and the all things from the Farangi Mahal and everything which they taught. By 70s, they went for bringing, I would say, innovation into the curriculum. And that innovation was bring those texts, particularly from certain themes of the disciplinary boundaries, which are not being taught in other Deobandi madrasas. So that was the second attempt. And the third attempt was from, I would say, the successive regimes. Either it was Ayub Khan, Yahya, then Zia, then Bhutto, everyone, one after the other. The attempted, I would say, coups into these places to bring them to the equality of the common journal syllabi of the formal educations. But that never happened. And at least 3 successive attempts, they met with total disaster or the failure. The other side was that once they started their own school, they started coming with the compatibility mode. That the people, those who are being trained in madrasa, many of them, they go to their own school as well. So in that case, the curriculum which they teach in the 4 walls of that madrasa, that is very different from the Wifaq's actual syllabus. So they teach their students extra books. And these extra books are basically helping them to reach to the same things which are being taught or covered by the other traditional followers of the actual curriculum. The second thing about the curriculum is that the curriculum which they followed or they looked into, they have had an academic committee which meets twice a year, look into the new innovations or the understanding, what we call in certain places the academic committees in universities or the board of studies and the board of faculties. They have maintained such type of thing, and the only responsibility for that thing is that this has to be updated annually. So Salana Karwai, when it comes with the Shuras, any meeting that is to be presented and approved. So in that case, curriculum has a very different reason. So the compatibility mode has a third case as well with the curriculum, that the people, those who are taught in these places, for example, Gulistan Bostan, which is taught by every madrasa, but when it comes towards the other sides, they always have the people, those who get them for the actual training of the languages. For example, unke yahan, when I was doing my field for consecutive 3 years in different times of the year, so they have hired a gentleman who has done a bachelor's, not that high bachelor, but he used to teach them English. And this was for the people, those who used to do the Mufti course, those who go for the Takhassus. And that was, ye nahi ki unko bahut achhi English padhai jati thi, the idea was to give them little know-how to use bits and pieces of those words, those which they can at least tell someone jab unse koi baat karne ke liye jaye. So that was one reason that slowly and gradually they brought innovation to the curriculum. And that curriculum which they have placed on their own website, because that is also one of the madrasa, those who are regularly updating their website as well. So if you just go to their website, you will find their monthly magazine updated since 83 onwards. You will find their regular curriculum being updated in certain years. So that is how they are dealing with this side. And that gives them this understanding of the innovation that they are very much involved into the Wifaq or their own education board since 70s. And this madrasa has a sizable representation in certain committees of the Wifaq when it comes towards the decision making or the other places.
Thank you for your question, Zara. So again, research on labor movements has gone through certain parabolas. So from the 1960s to the 1970s was a time when there were many theses coming out on labor. So these were very concrete empirical writings on particular labor movements. This was again work being done by people who were invested in some way in progressive politics. So it suffered from many of the problems that Thompson writes about, that British social history began critiquing in the 1960s. So it was a history that did not critically interrogate the role of the party and its contribution to the labor movement. So it was an argument that labor movement jo hain, they are a product of these broader political progressive movements. But again, beginning in the 1980s, when people like Zafar Shahid. So Zafar Shahid wrote his thesis in 79. It was published as a book in 2010, but his argument, which preempts in a sense what Dipesh Chakrabarty said in 89. So he took culture seriously. So that was way ahead of his times. He talked about how in order to understand the labor movement, in order to understand what it means, you need to take the cultural context seriously. It is within that context that the yearnings of labor can actually mean anything to you. So that of course happened at a time when people were already moving away from labor. So यहाँ पे जो है सोवियत यूनियन के कोलैप्स के बाद जो है एकदम से जो है वो किबला प्रोग्रेसिव्स का वो बदल गया था उसका रुख, उसके बाद वो एनजीओआइजेशन की फॉर्म में वो आपको नज़र आता है। और वो एनजीओज जो हैं वो बहुत से केसेस में वो पुराने प्रोग्रेसिव्स चलाते हैं जो उन्हीं रिसोर्सेज पे ड्रॉ करते हैं जो उन्होंने अपने पुराने लेबर एक्टिविज़म के टाइम पे कल्टिवेट की थी। हाँ, सो ये अभी जो सिचुएशन है, अभी ये सिचुएशन है कि there is some interest in doing labor history again. And what I tried to do again today was to try and showcase the potential of using labor history to ask questions that go beyond just labor history. So labor history हुई है, लेकिन वो different forms में हुई है, और उसका जो relationship है with larger intellectual currents which go beyond Pakistan, वो बहुत ज़्यादा हद तक उसको determine करता रहा है कि वो किस form में आई है। हाँ, सो इस वक्त जो है इंडिया में जो लेबर हिस्ट्री हो रही है, जो पिछले 20 साल में हुई है, पिछले 20-30 साल में, आई बिलीव एंड आई हैव ट्राइड टू आर्ग्यू कि दैट प्रोबेबली प्रोवाइड्स अ वे आउट ऑफ द इम्पास दैट वी फाइंड आवरसेल्व्स इन। तो एक तरफ तो है दैट काइंड ऑफ पोस्ट कलोनियल राइटिंग, दिपेश represents it also. He started in labor history but moved on to then of course bigger questions. लेकिन एक तरफ तो वो है एक पोस्ट कलोनियल पोस्ट मॉडर्न पर्सपेक्टिव कि जी कोई इसको इन्वेस्टिगेट करके कोई देयर इज नथिंग दैट यू गेट आउट ऑफ इट बिकॉज द लार्जर कल्चर दैट यू लुकिंग एट वाज नेवर अ bourgeois culture, it was never a capitalist culture. So using those categories from the West is meaningless.
What about empirical history? Those projects are valuable even beyond progressive politics. They're valuable for anybody. Empirical labor history, ke exactly patterns kya the, those kinds of things. Do you see anything like that happening in the future in Pakistan? Or
No, I hope it happens, but whatever labor history is being done, like my own thing, so it's very unimaginative. And I also don't focus on the labor process. There is a brief chapter in my book which focuses on the labor process. So it's not very empirical in that sense. So you don't get a sense of the texture of everyday working lives. Anushe is another labor historian working here. She's also concerned with the political dimensions more than the labor process. And you're absolutely right that if you have that material, dense empirical descriptions of the labor process, then they can be used for multiple purposes. But what we're doing is much more limited because it is a political problematic within which we're working. So yes, I agree.
Okay, although our time is up, but we can take one or two more questions. If any student wants to ask, yes, one over there.
I'm Hamna and my question is to Dr. Ahmed Azhar. I wanted to ask, sir, you mentioned about the archives and how the Miller treatment you mentioned. After 10-20 years, when we look back to the history, it will be another history. For example, we are viewing your paper. So are we going to use the same lens, or will there be other perspective? Because every time we look at the old archives, the records, the documents, there is always a new way of perceiving it. People have different opinions about it. Will it be the same, or people can have different opinions about it? And will this situation be the same, or can this differ based on the previous historical records we have?
Thank you, Hamna, for that. I hope there are more student questions as well. But it's not a matter of whether, it will invariably happen. Because when we go back to the archives, we go back with questions that are of interest to us. So मैंने जिस तरह interrogate किया था archives को, कोई और इंसान जिसका कोई और interest होगा वो नहीं करेगा. So it will happen, maybe not immediately, but a fresher, more original perspective than mine will emerge. So all we have to do is wait. The point I want to emphasize is that the emergence of that new perspective will always be tied into larger ideological structures. So जो academic जो milieu है उसके अंदर जो चीज़ topical है उसके ऊपर काम होगा उस moment में, और जो चीज़ उससे बाहर है उस पे शायद बिल्कुल भी काम नहीं होगा. So we shouldn't also imagine कि एक individual historian या archive जो भी access कर रहा है, इंसान, scholar, researcher, वो बस अपनी नज़र से देखेगा. उसकी नज़र भी जो है उसको शेप किया जा रहा है इस सारे स्ट्रक्चर से जिसके अंदर हम बैठे हैं. यू कैन सी हाउ इलैबोरेट दिस एंटायर थिंग इज. इट्स वेरी आर्टिफिशियल, इट्स वेरी आर्बिट्ररी. सो देयर इज नथिंग नेचुरल अबाउट व्हाट्स हैपनिंग हियर. थैंक यू.
Do we have more questions?
I have a question for Dr. Karrar. And Sajjad, please feel free to join in also. तो आप लोगों का पाकिस्तान के border areas में काम हुआ है, northern border areas में काम हुआ है. So what are the, if anyone wants to do work there, and what are the challenges? What are the particular political challenges that are there now? If I don't mind if this is a kind of thing that even if Fakhar or Ahmed Azhar wanted to talk about, it's not, of course you work at the borders, but you work in labor. So of course you're doing a particular kind of historical work. It's not necessarily, it doesn't impact, but we have certain kinds of political pressures and the changing political situation. It could be in China itself, it could be in Pakistan. So those border areas are sensitive, and what are the challenges for a researcher? And Fakhar, of course, from a very different angle, have you had any particular pressures, or people are wondering why you're doing what you're doing, people from different sides of society? So if you could talk a little bit about that, if you can, as much as you can. Thank you.
Thank you. It's an excellent question, and it's a question that's asked in other fields that I'm associated with as well. So another field of mine is Central Asian studies, and there too the question of risk comes up. It's also a very pertinent question these days with regard to the China field. And certainly, as you're suggesting, these questions need to be taken into consideration for working on certain topics and in certain areas within Pakistan as well. In Gilgit-Baltistan, we are seeing what I like to think of as everyday securitization. It's not obvious or evident if you go as a tourist, but if you go there with the purpose of doing research, then what you discover is that many topics become contentious, and so they bring you, they make you stand out as far as authorities are concerned. There's a border market by the name of Sust, which I've visited now, I think 5 or 6 times in the last 10 years. And the last time I was there, the last time I was there in fall, in November, taking photographs, which I often do, and so someone actually came up and said that, look, you can't take pictures of that and that building. And that's the first time that someone had actually said that to me. In 2016, I was in Gilgit-Baltistan with a Swiss anthropologist colleague of mine, and the day after we got there, we got a visit from people in the security services, and they said, well, what are you doing here? And it sort of struck us as being rather odd, because one would think of Gilgit-Baltistan as a place where tourists people are expected to go. And then, what they kept saying was that, well, this is a border area, and they kept repeating that. Till Mostolansky and myself, we found this whole question of the border area very interesting, and we actually hadn't planned on writing up anything at that point. We hadn't gone there with a research agenda, but then we spun a paper out of it, and we published it in Political Geography. So, I suppose is an example of how some of these encounters can lead to fruitful lines of inquiry as well. But beyond that, the point is well taken that there's many places where it would be very interesting to go and do field work. It would be very interesting to go and just sit in a place for a couple of weeks and observe what's happening. Gwadar is one such place, but it's simply not possible. And as an area specialist, as people who claim some sort of expertise in a particular area, one of the things that one has to be sensitive to is the fact that not all research projects are without risk, and very often we have to say that, look, this is something that someone else, another time, another generation, they'll have to pick it up, and you just let go of it.
Thank you. If I may add, very aptly said that that everyday securitization, as a tourist you don't feel it, but if you're going there as a researcher, I would, my own observation, my own experience, if I share, it depends at which sector are you going to do research. If you are doing on culture, language, music, literature, that to an extent you get, you are fine. But if you are going to study the nationalism, for instance, or the sectarianism, or these kind of sensitive topics, then you will have to, वो फिर आ जाएंगे फिर वो फिर आपको जवाब देना पड़ेगा, उनके दफ्तर में जाना पड़ेगा, फिर वो पूछेंगे आप क्या कर रहे हैं, क्यों कर रहे हैं. So it depends. Although a lot of people are sitting, but if I may share one of the incident that I encountered very recently. Kharman एक district है वहाँ पे, if anyone is familiar with it, and there is the same road which goes to Kargil. तो कारगिल का मार्का और वो सारी चीज़ें, वो 100 किलोमीटर दूरी था वहाँ से. तो खरमंग is considered again border. वो पूरा अच्छा एक बॉर्डर एरिया के अलावा एक और टर्मिनोलॉजी वहाँ पे, ये सेंसिटिव एरिया है, तो यहाँ पे आप ये काम नहीं कर सकते, सेंसिटिव एरिया. तो वो सेंसिटिव एरिया बस वो कोहिस्तान के बाद से शुरू हो जाता है. तो ऑल्सो एक आई मीन इफ यू आर डूइंग, pick up the contact person who is very influential. That's the trick that I always try to do. तो खरमंग में जो एक साहब थे बड़े influential थे, उनसे किसी रेफरेंस से बात हुई और मैंने कहा कि जी मैं आ रहा हूँ. अच्छा आप कब चलेंगे? मैंने कहा मैं स्कर्दू से चल रहा हूँ, बस घंटे डेढ़ में आपके पास पहुँच जाऊँगा. मैं वहाँ आया, वो किसी बिजी थे अपने बैंक में, उन्होंने एक बंदा मेरे साथ कर दिया कि आपको फलां साहब से मिलवा देंगे, आप 2-3 इंटरव्यूज़ करके फिर आप मेरे घर पे आ जाएँ, तो हम वहाँ बैठ के खाना वाना खाएंगे, चाय वाय पियेंगे, फिर आपसे बात होगी. उन्होंने मुझे बंदा साथ कर दिया, मैं गया. 2-3 घंटे हो गए, जब हम उनके घर पे पहुँचे दोपहर के टाइम पे, वो पहली मेरी मुलाकात है उनसे. कहते हैं आप कहाँ से आए हैं? मैंने कहा मैं तो बात हुई थी कराची से आया हूँ. आप कर क्या रहे हैं? आपके पीछे तो कोई नहीं है. तो मैंने कहा भाई अगर होगा तो मुझे नहीं पता कौन होगा. और मैंने कहा एक बंदा आया था आपका पूछने, तो मैंने उसको कह दिया मेरा मेहमान है, आप जाएं. तो आई गॉट दिस कि वो कौन बंदा था. अगर 2 बंदे आए थे बाइक पे आपका पूछने, तो वो आई गॉट दिस के भाई वो कौन बंदे थे. वो बहुत ऑब्वियस है, वो एवरीडे सिक्योरिटाइजेशन जो है वो बहुत ऑब्वियस है वहाँ पे, अदर देन द टूरिस्ट उसमें. जी फखर.
Looking into the archives fields and accessing them is always, you need to win the confidence first. This is what I have learned from my own experience. Once these gates or the windows or the doors started opening, then you can be comfortably consulting much more material. So first time when I came to field, I stayed inside like that institution for 6-7 hours. When I reached back to my place where I was staying at Bosan Road, Multan, someone knocked at my door. And this was the same thing, that, "Aap 7 ghante andar kisse mile?" So immediately, because I know someone inside, so I told him to show me your card. So this is very much the first question they usually will not respond to. So then he said, "Nahi ji, mere paas to aapki sari malumat hain." So he showed me my CNIC, my father's CNIC, my passport, my visa, my service card and everything. So then I was like little worried. And this was first time. So he said that, "I want to talk to you. Can we sit inside?" So I was not comfortable. I said, "Let's go outside." So instead of sitting inside, it's better to sit in the open place. So later on things were smooth and normal, and then I seen that guy for all my fields, inside, outside. So I won't say that's the secularization of the state or the institution or something. That is a very different perspective, that what you are looking forward to as a researcher, that it's something which you will be doing from a different perspective. And then the same gentleman, interestingly, was once at an airport to see me off, that "Waqai mein wapis ja raha hu," or "I am just staying inside," or what I do that. So I won't say that this is the thing happening every time, but sometimes when it comes with the places you choose for your own unit of analysis or study or the research, that also matters. And getting into those things, if it's a simple archive, going into any national, provincial archives or the centers or the other research centers is a very different thing. But when you are in the field, that is always that somewhere your file is being maintained. So what you are telling about Moltmanski, because I know him personally, and that again is the case, that always first landing in Islamabad or Lahore and then getting some security clearance to proceed to certain places, being either foreign national or the local nationals. So that always is the case. It's with different themes of the researches which you use or which you choose for your own future.
Okay, thank you very much. With this, this panel comes to an end. Thank you very much all the panelists for the enlightening and thought-provoking presentations and the discussions that followed. We are now going out for a tea, and then we have a panel roundtable discussion, and we encourage all the students to participate in that panel as well, doing history in Pakistan. Thank you very much.